recording. There we go. So that way, if there's anything particularly relevant at that time, I can go ahead and address it. I'll go ahead and keep an eye on it during some of those transitions. Otherwise, we'll get to a lot of those questions probably towards the end of the presentation. I just mentioned that now we are recording. So this session is being recorded today. What that means is that you don't have to worry about scrambling to take notes or anything like that. You will have access to this recorded session after probably towards the end of the week or so. Give us a few days to render that session, and we'll post it back on community on the live training post for today's session. That being said, we are recording. You may have noticed that as soon as you entered today's call, you were all automatically placed on mute. I'd like to keep it that way so that we make sure we have good audio for the whole presentation. But like I said, if you have questions or have something you want to ask or something you want to say, just go ahead and use that chat or Q&A function, and we'll try and address that for the crowd. All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. Oh, let me figure out where my PowerPoint presentation is. I don't know about you guys, but the new WebEx experience, if you guys have experienced that, is a little clunky for me. So please bear with me if you see me kind of fumbling around with my windows. That is probably why, because nothing is where I'm used to it. All right, so let's go ahead and start off with our agenda today. So before we go ahead and dive into the content, we'll talk about some of the upcoming trainings that we do have for the remainder of August. We'll do a little bit of background on the workflow and some of the concepts that we're going to be covering today during today's session. We're going to spend quite a bit of time in Designer really building out a workflow to take a look at how to parse and use some date-time functionality in Designer. And then towards the end, we'll talk about some resources and some avenues that you have for getting some support. So if you haven't already been to the Alteryx community, I highly encourage you to do so. Become an active participant, create a login, it's free. And once you do, you have access to so many wonderful resources, including discussion forums and knowledge-based articles and all the training that's available to you in Alteryx Academy, all the information and knowledge that you could ever want from the developer community. There is so much there at the community.alteryx.com. It's a great way to make some nerdy friends. That's what you're into. It's a great way to make some connections, share your knowledge, share what you know with other people, especially those who are seeking help or posting their questions on community. You're more than welcome to do that yourself. If you have a question, we encourage you to post and engage other participants and other community members to help you solve your own problems. We also have over 100 Alteryx use cases. So if you're looking for inspiration for what else is possible with Designer or what else is possible with Alteryx, I invite you to take a look at our use case matrix, which is in community, which has lots of different workflows, lots of different submissions from users just like you, sharing what they've done to solve a problem with Designer. If you see something else you'd like to incorporate in Designer, maybe a tool you think could benefit from some different functionality or some added functionality, we want to hear about it. So go ahead and submit your bright ideas over at our product ideas section of the community. Take a look at some of those blogs that are up there. And then again, if you're into developing your own tools, macros, and apps, maybe you're getting started with that. Python SDK, the developer community, which is going on about 1 year old right now, is there for you and such a wonderful resource. So I encourage you to sign in, get involved, participate with us at community.alteryx.com. So you may have noticed that in or on the community, we do have the section that is called the Alteryx Academy. This is where you can access all resources training. So that includes interactive lessons. A new course, I know I've been teasing it for a few weeks, is coming very soon. So keep your eyes peeled on the interactive lessons for some new content coming in towards the end of this month. Of course, we have live trainings, which I'll go back and revisit the calendar here in a second, but sessions just like this one. Every Tuesday, we meet for about an hour and we do a live training session. So take a look at what's upcoming there on our calendar. We also like to put you to the test in terms of our weekly challenges, where every week we post a problem. This past week was actually the 3rd lap of the Grand Prix that you may have seen at Inspire. If you were at Inspire in Anaheim, you saw those Grand Prix drivers competing on stage in front of thousands of people doing those 3 laps. And over the past few weeks, we've posted each of those laps so you can give it a try for yourself. Not, of course, not in front of thousands of people, unless you want to, but you can see exactly the experience, exactly the workflows that they had to solve right there in front of you in 12 minutes or less. So every Monday we post a new one up there. So we invite you to go ahead and get involved there and put your skills to the test. And then finally, with product certification, we have 3 levels of certification. We have core, advanced, and expert. Expert will be the next opportunity to take that one. Will be at Inspire London here in a few months. That's where you can really put your skills to the test, if I may. That's where you can sign up free exams for core and advanced, where you can certify your skills. You can demonstrate what you've learned and get a badge on community, get an official certificate for demonstrating your knowledge. So all of that for you is at academy.alteryx.com, part of the community there, just the Academy tab. So let's go back and revisit what's upcoming in terms of live training for the rest of this month. So here we are at August 14th in terms of parsing dates and times. So like I said before, we're going to spend quite a bit of time today talking about all that functionality with how to deal with date, time, and date time data types in Designer. Next week, we're going to have a session that's geared a little bit more towards a beginning user. It's called Alteryx for the SQL Analyst. So some of you, I'm sure, have a very strong background in SQL, and maybe you're making that migration over to Alteryx, and you want to learn exactly what is the equivalent of a task that you used to do in SQL, and how do you do that in Designer? How do you do that with Alteryx? So we're going to spend quite a bit of time next week in that session kind of going through some of those, I call them translations, if you will, from one kind of program to other. And then finally, towards the end of the month, August 28th, we're going to be running a session on tips and tricks, some of those things that you might see someone do and just think to yourself, I had no idea you could ever do that. So those are a really neat sharing session here that we have planned for the end of the month. And then September, you can see our calendar is still being built out, so stay tuned for more information to come in terms of what we're going to offer in the month of September for live trainings. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into our content and what we're actually going to be talking about today. Again, dates and times. Our use case today, sorry for the blurry image, it's a little bit large, I know, but I don't know if any of you have ever seen this on dollar bills, but have any of you ever seen the track this bill, George Washington dollar bills? And there's actually a website where you can go and log where you saw this George dollar bill, when you last had it, who last had it, where has this dollar bill traveled to. It's kind of a fun little use case. So what we're going to do today is we're actually going to use some of this dollar bill data that we found, and we're going to accomplish a few different date time calculations and processing steps using some of this data. So our issue that we have today is that we have 4 different data sources that contain information on dates and times. We know they do, but they need to be converted into usable formats so that we can actually analyze them and perform some calculations on them. So some of our goals for today is, first, is understand the appropriate format for date-time data type. So how can you use, or what is a date-time format? Let's start there. In Designer, what does that even mean, and how does that need to be formatted for you to be able to, 1, convert your data into date-time data types, and then 2, perform calculations on those different data types. And to do that, so we're going to cover a couple of different processes today about, we call it parsing dates, and I say that because that date time tool there at the bottom in green is part of the parsing tool palette in Designer. So we're going to be parsing dates to kind of glean or gather different pieces of information from that date time data. We're going to actually officially convert these fields to date time data types. We'll talk about that in just a second about what that really means in Designer. And then we're going to do some date calculations. So how do we use the formula tool and some of those date time calculations to go about adding time, subtracting time, converting time, all sorts of things like that. So you can see here on the right, there's a bit of the workflow that we're working toward today. So we're going to be converting quite a bit of those 4 different data types. We're going to be unioning all together so that way we have one big data set of where George Washington has been. And then finally, we're going to just do a little bit of a brief analysis there in terms of how long have these bills been in circulation, or at least how long have they been tracked in terms of being tracked with the George Washington timestamp there. So the really big tools that we're going to cover today, I expect most of the other tools in here, like the input data tool and the select tool, the union tool, I expect those to be probably very familiar to everyone on this call. But we're really going to spend quite a bit of time with that date time tool. We're going to use it in a couple of different ways. And then we're also going to spend quite a bit of time with the formula tool in terms of the date time functionality. So first, let's talk a little bit about Alteryx date time formats. What really does that mean? Well, I'm going to be talking quite a bit about date time data types when really we can think about this in 3 different data types. We have date, we have time, and we have date time. And date time is really just a combination of date and time. So when we say date time data type, we're really talking about this very specific format that is formatted as you see here, the 4-digit year, dash, 2-digit month, dash, 2-digit day, space, 2-digit hour, colon, 2-digit minute, colon, 2-digit seconds. If it does not fit that format right off the bat, if it's not formatted exactly like this, Designer will read in data that's maybe formatted like 3/14/18, that's automatically going to be a string. It's not recognized right away as a date. There's, 8:30 a.m. is not recognized immediately as a time. It has to be formatted in this very, very specific way. So we're going to go ahead, and I know it's pretty rare that you'll actually get data in that exact format that you need, which is why we can format data using specifiers and separators, and we can convert data into date time data types. So let's talk a little bit about formatting data using specifiers and separators. As you can see on the right here, we have a date time, 2018-08-13, so yesterday's date, August 13th of 2018 at 10:30 a.m. essentially. Or from the 24-hour clock, it's still 10:30 a.m., so that worked out well. So when we say we want to get different information pieces using a specifier, what we're really talking about is coding in a way or parsing this 2018-08-13, 10:30 a.m. into a usable piece of information like the full name of the month. The specifier is %B, or maybe it's an abbreviated day, which is the specifier %A, or maybe it's day of the year, %lowercase j, it's 225. Yesterday was the 225th day of 2018. And let's take a little bit of time. Let me go ahead and escape here and show you where you can find some more information as to where these specifiers are and what they mean. So let me go ahead and walk through some of this help documentation here because it is a little difficult to find. So here I am at the help documentation. I'm going to go ahead and jump into the designer section of the help documentation. How I like to go ahead and navigate this is I like to talk about tool categories. This helps me first, and I'm going to go into the document, or I'm sorry, the preparation palette, so the blue, because a lot of this information is going to be where you find information from the formula tool. The formula tool's functions list contains all the different types of functions that it contains for all of its different function types. And the one that we're most interested in here is date time. The date time format, or the date time category, goes into quite a bit of information about specifiers and separators. And I just want to point this out here because these different specifiers, the ones I showed you, those are not at all what you're limited to. We don't just have 3 different specifiers that you can use to get information. You actually have quite a few here that you can get a lot of different information with. So for example, you could get the day of the month by using a %D. So you could get a digit out of it, you could format time, you can get the day of the year, there's that %J. So we're going to be using quite a few of these specifiers today to help us get or understand different components of a date or time that we'll need in order to create or format a date time data type. So I want you to just understand where we're getting these specifiers from so that way you can reference back to these in case you ever want to. And I will go ahead and on the post for today's live training, I'll make sure to post this link right here so that way you have a really quick just link right there to this information for the date time category. All right, so now that we have gotten there, let's go ahead. And when we talk about separators, I realize I just forgot about that. Separators here, we're going to insert specifiers to format a string. So those are like your dashes or your slashes in order to indicate this little bit right here. This is where we're breaking different pieces of information. So let's go ahead and dive into our designer portion of today's training. And I think some of this will make much more sense. All right, so before I go ahead and do that, let me just take a moment to just peruse the Q&A for anything that may have come up. All right, looks like we are good to continue. All right, so now you should be seeing Designer, and you should be seeing 4 different input tools, each with a browse attached. I'm going to go ahead and run this. So that way you can see exactly what we're dealing with here. So we've got 4 different inputs that we're going to be working with today. Let's just take a little bit of time to go through each one. So the first one here is just called Alteryx $YXDB. We're dealing with YXDB files. Let's take a little bit of a look here at our results window. So what's in this data is a serial number. So every dollar bill has a serial number attached to it. So you can see that this particular data set has data associated with this particular bill and the date on which it was entered. Where was this, or when was this dollar bill entered into that Find George Washington database? And where was that dollar bill when it was entered, city and state? We don't really mind, or we're not really going to pay much attention to the city and state component of today's data set. It's just kind of fun to see, where this dollar bill has been, and you can see how far money really does travel. But we're really going to be focusing on these columns that contain date and time information. This first one here that we're going to be working with is just Alteryx $.yxdb. And you can see here that our entry date has a 4-digit year, dash, 2-digit month, dash, 2-digit day, space, 2-digit hour, colon, 2-digit minute, colon, 2-digit second. Now, you might remember that that format sounds very familiar, right? Because this is the Alteryx way of saying, yes, I am a date time data type. You can see right now, because we've brought it in, it's actually classified as a string. So in order to make it a date time data type, the simplest thing that we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and go up to our preparation tool palette, and we're going to just use a simple select tool, which is probably exactly how you've been converting date or data types all along, if you're more familiar with this kind of concept. So because I am formatted correctly in my entry date column, I can go ahead, let me just pull this down here so we get all of our strings up here. I can go ahead and in this field, this entry date field, I can go ahead and just change the data type straight away to a date time data type. Now you'll notice here, remember how I mentioned that there is a date type, there is a time type, and there is a date time type. So if you only wanted the date, let's just run this through. You can see what's going to happen here is that this date is just going to truncate. It's essentially going to say I only want that 4-digit year, dash, 2-digit month, dash, 2-digit day. And if I were to say I actually just want it to be a time data type, well, now what do we get? We get the 2-digit hour, 2-digit minute, 2-digit second. So if you have that date time data type, you can pick and choose some of those components of that date time data type to work with if that's what you would like to do. I'm going to go ahead and just use date time for everything today. We're going to go ahead and return the date and the time components and just turn it right away into that kind of data type. So now we can see we have the data. It hasn't changed in terms of format because it was already read in the correct format. But what has changed is now in this metadata tab, now you can see that my date time, my data type has actually changed. So that is something to pay attention to, especially because as we go forward with some of our formula tools and some of our formula functionality, it really does depend on your data being formatted correctly. It really does depend on your data having that date time data type. So that was easy. That was our first one. It's probably not ever going to be that easy for you unless your data is formatted beautifully and perfectly every time you read in data. What's more likely for you is that you're going to encounter data that's formatted like this data set. So now we're working on number 2, which is the datetime $.yxdb. Again, you can see different bill, serial number, but take a look at this entry time column and see how it's formatted. Looks like, I mean, it could be 2-digit month, could be 2-digit day, but we at least know that the year is here. But really some of the giveaways with this, with how it is formatted, is that we definitely don't have the 26th month. So we know that this has to be August, so 08, 2-digit month, dash 2-digit day, dash 4-digit year. Now this is not at all read in as a, or can't be read in as a date time data type. Designer does not know what this is. And of course you'll find that this is automatically read in as a string. So right now this is just a bunch of numbers with some punctuation, read in as a string, can't be used in terms of a date time data type. So in order to convert it to be that way, let's go ahead and drag on a date time tool from the parse category. I'm just moving some windows around here, pardon me. So let's go ahead and drag on that date time tool, which is here in the parse palette. I'm just going to go ahead and drag it on and connect it right here. So the date time tool palette gives you a couple, or the date time tool, sorry, gives you a couple of different options here. And one is you can select the format to convert. You can either go from date time format to a string, or you can go from a string to a date time format. More likely than not, you'll probably be going from a string to date time format, which is why you'll be using this tool in the first place. That's the method that we're going to be using today. We want to move from a string data type to a date time formatted string, so that way we can convert it to a date time data type. The first thing you're going to want to do here is select the string field to convert. So it gives you all your available string fields from the incoming data stream. You want to make sure you pick the right one. That typically helps. I'm going to go ahead and pick the column entry time. And you'll notice that the new column name, specify the column name, the default is always date time out. We can rename it here. I'm going to wait till we throw on a different select tool down the line just for clarity purposes, but you certainly can rename your outgoing column right here, kind of like you were in a select tool. You have a little bit of that functionality. Now for this first method, we're going to be selecting a format that matches the incoming string field. So we want to pick the format that matches the format of this entry time column. So remember that 2-digit month dash 2-digit day dash 4-digit year. Now by default, we offer quite a few commonly used formats for incoming strings. So you might see some of these, these match pretty well. So some of those more commonly ones have slashes or different locations where your day is, or different kind of, if you have the abbreviated day and then the name of the month and the year. So we have a lot of different kind of default or pre-formatted formats that are available for you to match on in the date time tool. Luckily for this example, we do match one of those pre-formats, which is this one with the 2-digit month dash 2-digit day dash 4-digit year. So we're going to say, yes, our column entry time matches this particular format. And this is the format that I want to use. So I'm going to go ahead and run my data here so we can see what we've done. So you can see it doesn't actually change this column entry time in the results window. Our original column stays put, stays the same. What you do at this point is you output a brand new column, which is that date time out column. And you can see it's formatted now based on that nice, match that we said it should match on. So designer has said, okay, for the designer date component of my date time data type, I can now match what you've given me to a format that I recognize, which is now that 4-digit year dash 2-digit month dash 2-digit day. So right now, we're at a date data type. So right now what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and put on a select tool, because I'm going to just say I am going to change my field name, 1, so that I can match my others, and I'm going to make myself a date time. I'm actually going to, instead of a date data type, I'm going to convert myself to be a date time data type. And we'll see what that's going to do. And like I said, I'm going to go ahead and rename it here in the select tool, even though I could have done that in my date time tool. And let's take a look at what happens now. So from my select tool, because I only had date information, I didn't actually have a distinct time, you can see that everything's been converted to midnight, essentially, 0 hours, 0 or 0 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds for that particular date. So it really doesn't add any really additional information. It's just mostly converting it to the date time data type component that's going to be important for us later on. So now let's go ahead and take a look at our third one. This is where we're going to get a little bit more complex. So you can see for this date, or for this particular input data set, we have one serial number here for a different bill, where it's been, but take a look at this entry date column here. It's formatted a little bit oddly, formatted a little bit more not quite so user-friendly for what we want to use this for. So now we have a component here that's a 1-digit or 2-digit month. You can see here, so we have May 5th, 2014, but we also have October 1st, 2008 here. So we're missing that 2-digit month component. It varies. Then we have the day, so 1 or 2-digit days. Always a 4-digit year, which is nice. It at least keeps things somewhat consistent. But now take a look at our time format. Definitely not that 2-digit hour, 2-digit minute, 2-digit seconds. What we have now is a 12-hour clock instead of a 24-hour clock. We have AM and PM to be working with. So we want to convert this to that Alteryx format, that 4-digit year, month, day kind of format, and then the 24-hour clock. So let's take a look at how we can accomplish this. This is where we're really going to be working with those specifiers that I put it out. So if you want to maybe pull that up in your help documentation as we go along, that might be a good idea. But again, this is being recorded, so you can revisit this later. So let's go ahead and take another date time tool, drag it onto our canvas here. We're going to work on now our third input data set. So here in our configuration window, we do want to continue moving from a string data type. Remember, this is just a string data type with a whole bunch of numbers and punctuation and now some capital letters in here. And we want to move to a date time format. We are going to pick the column entry date. And again, I'm just going to, well, let's go ahead and, well, no, because I want to rename it the same way. So we'll go ahead and leave the default column name here as well. So what you may notice right now is that selecting the format that matches the incoming field, automatically Designer recognizes that, hey, this entry date column that you've specified for me, this doesn't match anything that I know. This doesn't match any of my pre-specified formats that are available for you to match on. And instead, it went automatically to custom. You need to specify your custom format of your data here in this tool in order for me to understand what's going on. And the way that we're going to do this with this custom format is by specifying the format here in this text box using a combination of specifiers. So remember those percent case-sensitive letters. So let's go ahead and start. So we know first that the first value that's in our entry date column is a month. And it can be a 1 or 2-digit month. So the specifier for month is percent lowercase m. And as you can see, as I start building, you can see in this example right here that it's starting to try and match or build what it thinks it should look like. So you can start to see that this percent month, the example down here is what I have, and you can see how it's going to be formatted here in our results. So right now it's starting that process. So our 2-digit month is separated from the rest of the data by a /. So I'll go ahead and type that in here. So far, our example match is looking pretty good. So let's move on to that next component, which is the day. So the specifier for day is %d. And as you can see now, we're starting to work on that example. So we have January 2nd building out in that example. So far, so good. So let's continue with our another slash, which is how our data is formatted. And the specifier for year is %Y. Now to show you what I mean in terms of why case matters, instead of that uppercase Y, let's type a lowercase y. Do you see how in the example, all of a sudden it thinks that my year is formatted as a 2-digit year? So as if instead of 2018, we're just saying 18, or instead of the year 2000, it's just 00. This is why case sensitivity really can matter. You'll get wildly different information depending on the case of your specifier. So with that uppercase Y, you'll now notice that we have the 4-digit year, which is what we want. So we'll continue with it there. But I just want to draw your attention to the fact that case sensitivity really can matter, and that can really affect the results that you get out of some of these date time parsing or date time formatting functions that you use specifiers with. So then after we have the year, we do have a space, and now comes the kind of tricky part. We're dealing now with AM and PM, right? That 12-hour clock. So anywhere from 8:52 AM or 9:32 PM. How are we going to tell it that we want it to be in this 24-hour clock? We're going to use a couple more specifiers, and that first one is going to be %I, %I, to be more specific. And then we're going to say colon, and then we're going to say %M for the minutes, which is what we have. So you can see now that hour in a 12-hour clock, colon, minutes. And then we're going to indicate AM or PM, so space, %p. So now in that example, you can see the example data is built out just like the format that we have in the column entry date, right? And then we can see on the other side how this is actually going to be formatted in terms of that date time data type. So that all looks nice. That all aligns nicely. So this is kind of a benefit here of the date time tool instead of working, because you can do similar functionality to this in the formula tool. But I like to use that date time tool for some of this custom matching because it builds out that example for me. It's kind of a nice check, especially when I'm doing some of this custom formatting. Fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and run this here just so we can see what happened. So out of our third input here now, remember that we keep our original entry date field, and I'm actually working with this date time out column. So now you can see, based on that custom format with those specifiers that we put into our date time tool, we've actually come out now with our correctly formatted Alteryx date time data type. Fantastic. You can see now we are at a date time data type. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing here. Let's just go ahead and throw on a select tool. Could have renamed it in the other column here, but I'm going to go ahead and deselect that and rename my new date time out field. That's the date time to entry date. And let me just double check my top one here to make sure I did that same thing. We're going to just remove that one for clarity. All right. So now we're working with 3 different inputs. Let's move on to our final one. We're doing pretty well on time, so we're going to have plenty of time to work through this one, which is great. So one of the weirder date time data types that you may encounter, especially those of you who might be working with Mongo databases and such, is hex, which you can see here in this column, entry date, looks pretty unusable at this point. There's really nothing here that indicates it's any kind of date time data type that we can use with the date time parse tool or the date time tool. We're going to have to use the formula tool for this one to deal with some of these different formats of data types, which is we're going to have to use hex. We're going to have to convert this kind of data type into something that's actually usable. So what's interesting about this data type is really the information that matters here are these first 8 digits or so of this actual column. So the first thing that we're going to do, I'm going to drag a formula tool onto my canvas, connect my incoming data stream, is that the first step I'm going to do is I'm going to create a column real quick that I'm just going to call sub. And I'm going to call it that because really all I want out of this is the substring. I only want the first 8 characters, I believe, 9 characters of that entry date column. I want to start at position 0. And I want to return the length, so I'm going to return the 8 characters here. This is the portion of this column that I really care about. You see there's lots of zeros after that, not really usable for me. I want to return this portion that now I'm going to deal with a hex function. So with that string, I'm going to go ahead and add a new column here that I'm going to call for unit hex. And I'm going to use a little known or little used function that's called the hex to number. This hex to number value that I'm going to run on my column that I just created called sub is actually going to return the number of seconds that I'm going to need to add to the year of January 1st, 1970, which is kind of a weird little time conversion here, but hey, I didn't make the rules, I just work with the data. So to deal with that now, we're going to actually start with our first date time calculation. And I forgot one step here. Because I'm returning the number of seconds that have followed since this 1970, January 1st, I actually want to convert this to a double. I want this to be a numeric output. And let me just run that again for good measure, make sure it went through. So now for that last step, and again, this is just kind of for fun because I don't imagine that many of you will be doing these. I just want to show you kind of the depth of the functionality that really does exist, or kind of the complexity that can exist within date time data types, is that now we're going to use our first date time add function. So there is a whole category in here in our functions library that's called date time. So again, remember in that help documentation, you saw how we expanded those different categories in the functions tab. This is where they all align to. So here's that date time category, and the function that we're going to use is called date time add. And I want to take a little bit of time, let's see if this hover will stay, and it does, is what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be adding a specific interval to a date time. So we have a date, and then we're going to add a unit, and then we have to specify the unit that we're adding. So let's break this down. So we're going to add to the date 1970 0101. We're going to add the interval, which is the number of seconds that we just put out in our column unhexit. And then the unit that we are going to be adding here is seconds. So now you can see that once we're going to perform this particular function, we're actually going to be outputting from all this hex data here to something that's actually usable, which is kind of cool. So let's go ahead and run this to demonstrate. So now you can see our entry date column here that we've nicely formatted has been changed quite a bit to this 4-digit year, 2-digit month, 2-digit day, and all the way down to that 24-hour clock, that time on a 24-hour clock. So that is pretty handy. But what didn't happen here, as you'll notice, is that we didn't actually convert ourselves to a date time data type. We're still a string. So what we didn't get ourselves out of is having to drag a select tool onto the canvas and then changing ourselves into a date time data type. I'm going to deselect some of these unnecessary fields that we're going to need for later. So now you've essentially seen the whole gamut of ways that you can deal with date time data. But let's take this a little bit of a step further, and let's just go ahead and analyze these so that we can get under our belts just another function or so with working with some of these date time diff functions to figure out how old or how long has this bill been tracked. So to put all of these different input into a single data source, I'm now going to go ahead and union all of these together. I'm going to create one big data set here of all of my bills so I can aggregate and do some analysis on these. And let me just go ahead and manually configure just to check that everything lines up. Yep, we look good here. So let's go ahead and run this. Fantastic. So entry date. This column has data beautifully formatted in our correct date time data type for all of our different bills. And let's just double check here in the metadata. Yes, everything in this column, date time data type. So now we are ready to go ahead and start some analysis. The first thing I'm going to do, just to aggregate things nicely, is I just want to figure out for every dollar bill, so for every unique dollar bill based on serial number, just going to group by there, let's figure out what the minimum date is. What is the date farthest back that we have for each bill? I'm going to go ahead and use the min function for the entry date column. So this way I'm going to should output 4 different records, 1 for each bill, at the earliest date that we have data on for which it was tracked in that Find George Washington database. So you can see that some of these bills have been around quite a while, since 2001, February 15th, that's the earliest record we have of it in terms of, and then we have 2006, 2002, 2006. So now with the analysis that we want to do is let's figure out how many days this is. How many days from today has this bill been around? How many days has this bill been circulating, at least on the Find George Washington database? And the first thing we are going to do is figure out what the difference is. What the difference is from today's date to the minimum entry date in terms of days. I'm going to drag another formula tool onto the canvas here, and we're going to use, instead of a datetime add function, we're going to be using a datetime diff function. I'm going to create a new column. Let's call it oldest entry here in this example, and we're going to output, because the unit that we're going to be outputting, or the data that we're going to be outputting, is number of days that this bill has been tracked. I probably want that to be a numeric data type, right? So I'm going to go ahead and just say double, even though it will turn out to be an integer, but that's okay. We'll say double for this one. And the function that we're going to be using here from this function library is called datetime_diff. So you can see here, instead of a datetime add, so that's adding time to a date, datetime_diff is finding the difference, essentially kind of the opposite here, the difference in a unit between 2 different date times. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this one into our expression editor here, into datetime_diff between datetime_1 and datetime_2. And the units that we want to be using here, or the dates that we want to be using, are between today's date and the minimum entry date. So for today's date, to actually fill in this component of DT1, I'm just going to go ahead and delete that, I can actually use a different function. I can use, if I had today's date, maybe like in a text entry tool or something that I joined to this data set, yes, I would have that data in a column. But if you just want to use today's date, and again, this is particularly useful if you want this to be super dynamic, so every time you run this workflow, you're actually using today's date. So if you run this workflow tomorrow, it'll be using August 15th instead of the 14th. There's a really handy function that is called the datetime_now. And so I'm going to start typing in here, datetime_now. So this is actually a function that returns the current date and time. And I'm just going to leave inside my parentheses blank because it's for today. There's no variable to actually fill in. So the datetime_diff between today and datetime_2, which is going to be that minimum entry date that we have, which is a variable. And I want to know the difference between these 2 dates in days. I do have the option here of specifying minutes. I think I can do years. So I have different available options to me in terms of what that that interval or that unit can really be. But the important thing here to know is that that unit has to be quoted. You may not have caught that the last time I did it with my date time add by adding the number of seconds, but that unit that I'm either subtracting or I want to return needs to be quoted. That's something I often see people forgetting to do and wondering why they're getting an error about it. So I thought I would make a special note of that. So with the number of days here, you can see we already have a preview of what's going to be happening, is how many days from today's date has this bill been in circulation according to findgeorgewashington.com. And so here we go. Here's our oldest entry now. We can see that our bills here have been tracked, or have been tracking for, gosh, over 6,000 days, which is pretty impressive. So that is just one example of what you can do here in terms of the date time diff. Now let's go ahead and run this. Let's just say, let's change this to be seconds, so you can just see what exactly you can run or return from this data. You can also return that different unit in the expression for the number of seconds that this bill has been tracked for based on this database in here as well. So now let's talk about some of the different other functionality in here to say, let's find some information. Let's use some more specifiers here to find some more information. Let's say that we didn't necessarily care about what that minimum entry date really is. Maybe we just want to know the month that this date has been tracked on, or we want to know maybe what day this represents. What day of the week was this minimum entry date? Let's use another specifier to go ahead and say, let's return some of that information. And the reason I want to bring this up is because I do want to say, or I do want to emphasize, that we have a couple of different functions in here in the formula tool. That's called datetime format, and then we also have datetime parse. So instead of parsing this data, I'm actually going to go ahead and format this. So I'm actually going to go ahead and let's create a new column in here called day. And I'm going to use another function in here that's called datetime format. So the datetime format is really handy for getting some of that information, like the day of the week, with this specified format string. So we take this datetime data type, and then we say, give me some information with this specifier to say what is some more information about this that I can use as a string or a number data type. So let's go ahead and try this one out. So for this date time, we're going to say from this minimum entry date, let's now go ahead and use a specifier to return, let's say, full weekday name. So what day of the week was this particular date? So you can see %A for the full weekday name. Abbreviated weekday name would be %lowercase a. So again, case matters. Let's do the full weekday name, so that'll be %uppercase A. So when we return these formats, you'll see if I just start typing here %uppercase A, that we're still not formatted correctly. So just like when you have a unit that you want to return, you do need to quote your specifiers. And that will help return some of that information about that date time. So for good measure, let's go ahead and run this. So now you can see that minimum entry date. What day of the week was that day back in 2001 on February 15th? Well, that day was a Thursday. We have Sunday, Friday, and Monday. So just some other fun ways that you can use strings to get date time data types. You can also use date times data types and data stored as date times to get other other information that you don't necessarily see, whether that's month or date number or year number or the time. You can also kind of go the other way in gleaning some more accessible information from those date time data types. So that brings us to the end of the demo, which is good timing. So let's just go ahead and go through some of the avenues that you have for support. So let's say you are ready to get started, ready to dive in some deeper with these date time data types. You run into trouble. What can you do? Well, first, I would recommend going to the Alteryx community. There's tons of, again, where you can post your questions, opportunities to search those discussion forums for people who have had questions probably very similar to yours, where you can read some knowledge base articles and share what you've learned or share what you know at community.alteryx.com. We also have a really great lesson on Alteryx Academy, specifically in an interactive lesson, that's all about using date time functions in the formula tool. So if you really want to explore more about how we can use those datetime add or datetime diff or datetime now functions, how they can be used together, what types of things you can do with parsing and formatting data, that's probably a great resource for you to check out. Again, we've got some weekly challenges up there that I know deal with datetime data times or datetime data types that are very accessible for beginners, but also pretty challenging for those of you who are into challenging your parsing skills. And I know that date time appears in some of our certification questions as well. So Academy is a great way to go ahead and develop these skills as well as test these skills in terms of date time parsing. And if you're really in a bind, don't know what to do next, go ahead and send an email to our support team at support@alteryx.com. Some of the friendliest, smartest people I know, and I'm sure they'd be able to, they'd be happy to help you get you right back on the right track with some of this date time parsing stuff. So with that, that brings us to the end of our session. Thank you again for joining us today. Hopefully we'll see you again next Tuesday for our session for core concepts for SQL analysts. And at this time, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen, let some of you get back to your Tuesday, and I'll take the opportunity to answer any questions that have come in through the chat or the Q&A.